And welcome back everyone to the giveaway Gladiator build series, and today we are beefing up the power steering with some heavy duty parts from PSC. Now the big push these days is to make vehicles lighter for better efficiency. And one of the ways automotive manufacturers are doing that is using a lot of aluminum. The JLs and JTs are now coming with aluminum doors, aluminum hood, and many other components made out of aluminum. And not all of it is good. One of the components we've seen on JLs and JTs up until now is an aluminum steering box. And we're seeing deflection with that steering box. So we grabbed a dial indicator to show you what we mean. We stuffed that dial indicator down on the frame, got one of the mechanics to wiggle the steering wheel back and forth, and you can see that needle moving. That is over 20 thousandths of an inch deflection from the steering box, and that's just wiggling the steering wheel with the tire sitting on the ground. Now imagine what would happen once you put a bigger tire on and you start crawling through an off-road trail. But we have a fix for you. And the fix is in the form of a heavy-duty, big bore power steering kit with hydro assist from PSC. And that kit comes with everything that you see here. It's got the new heavy-duty big bore box. It's got a traditional belt-style high-performance hydraulic pump. It comes with a cooler, reservoirs, heavy-duty steering arm, a hydraulic ram, hoses, hardware, everything you need, including Swepco 715 high-performance power steering hydraulic oil. Now the star of the show is the PSC Big Bore power steering box. This box features a heavy-duty cast iron case that's much larger and carries bigger bearings, which allow for this massive 45mm sector shaft. The factory case, well, it's aluminum. It has that flex that we saw earlier. As you can see, it's also quite a bit smaller. The bearings are smaller, and it only has a 40mm sector shaft. The PSC Big Bore box is definitely designed to help you steer those big tires on big off-road trails. Now, as you can see by all the components in the kit, this is a fairly involved install, so it's best left to the experienced backyard mechanics or the professionals. You can also see that we've already stripped down the Gladiator in preparation. We've removed the front bumper and winch, the grille, and both front fenders, and that's just to get at the factory steering components. So I'm going to grab a couple wrenches and let's get at it. To start, we're going to use a 10mm wrench and socket to remove the 4 bolts that are holding the factory power steering lines in place. Next up is the factory power steering reservoir. Then we're going to reach down here and pull the wiring harness off the electro-hydraulic pump. All right, now we're going to go back up. Now the factory electro-hydraulic pump uses this double bracket assembly. The pump bolts to this bracket, which then bolts to the frame. So let's remove the 3 10mm bolts holding the pump to the bracket, 1, 2, and 1 on the other side. And then we'll remove these 2 12mm bolts holding it to the frame. Lift this pump up, then remove this bracket. And then let's see if we can squeeze this pump out between the frame and hoses. All right, with the electro-hydraulic pump hanging here, now we can disconnect our hoses and start draining the system. So now at the back of the steering box, we have the steering coupler that goes up to the steering shaft. We want to get in there with a 13mm socket and remove the bolt. Then we can take a screwdriver and slide it right in between the box and that steering joint and just slide that joint off. All right, next up is to get an 18mm wrench in on the fittings for the power steering lines. And we're gonna loosen those up. Sometimes a short wrench comes in handy to get back in there. All right, then we can grab a couple rags, lift those lines up, grab a hold of the ends of the lines, and start wiggling our way out. We can use a 19mm wrench and remove the 4 bolts that are holding the steering box in place. There's the factory steering box. Now we do have to remove the belt, this whole idler assembly. To do so, we've got to remove the vacuum pump and bracket assembly. We also have to remove the alternator, and to get this bracket out so we can remove the old belt and get the new belt in there. Slide your breaker bar in on the square on the idler, and then the longer the better. And then compress the ram and you can pull the belt off. So now we've got to get our alternator out of the way. Now the first PSC component we're going to be installing is that new belt-driven high-performance power steering pump. And it's going to bolt right up here alongside the engine block and take place of the factory idler pulley. For you JL owners out there, PSC includes a bracket that bolts right into the engine and allows that pump to bolt right in. For the JT owners, the engine mount isolator is quite a bit larger on the JT than the JL, and so you just can't put that JL bracket in there easily. To fix that, PSC has built this new engine mount bracket. It has this machine flat face, their pump bolts right up to it. However, we do have to do a little bit more work to install this bracket. So we're going to start out by removing this wire harness clip here. And then remove the bolts holding the engine bracket to the engine. Now to get to the engine isolator bolts in the back, it's real helpful to unbolt this wiring harness, and then you can get your hand back in there to get at those bolts. Woohoo! Look at that. And then you can grab your factory isolator, lift it right up and out. So here's the two brackets side by side. The one here on my right is the factory JT engine mount bracket, and the one here on my left is the PSC replacement engine mount bracket. Now just so you see how it all goes together, here's the PSC engine mount bracket, and this is that engine mount isolator. It's going to slip up in and it engages in place. Now it took a while to get out, and one of the things you're fighting is this long pin. So we're going to cut it down about halfway, which will make it much easier to get everything back in place. Now before we install the new PSC engine mount back into the Gladiator, we need to do a little trimming on the isolator. You can see this rib right here, and under compression, as the engine's moving, it can hit that rib. So we need to do a little cutting. So we're just going to trim it about that much out. That'll give us the extra room. And now with it trimmed, we have lots of room for movement now. We just got to get a little paint in there to protect the bare metal, and it's ready to go back in the rig. All right, now we can get that. Now the factory isolator can go back in place. And the new PSC engine mount bracket. Trimming that little locating pin makes a huge difference in being able to move this up and down. Now that we got that new engine mount in, we can install our belt-driven pump. Set it in place. As you pull your belt off, make sure you note exactly how it goes around all the different pulleys. And let's put the new one in. All right, now compress your tensioner and stick the belt onto the new PSC High Performance Power Steering Pump. Then install your power steering cooler. We painted the bracket black just so it doesn't stand out so much behind the grill. For your cooler hoses, you have two of them. There's a short and a long. The short goes on the right-hand side of the vehicle. The long goes on the left-hand side. You have two fittings for the gearbox. The smaller of the two is your high pressure line. The larger of your two is the return line. Take our high pressure line, and we're going to slide it right up along the power steering box. And hook it to the high pressure fitting. Now we can screw our return line on. All right, grab your Swepco and dip your finger in and wipe the barb fittings. Now move the clamps up by the fittings, but we won't slide the clamp all the way onto the fitting, just so we can rotate the hose into position. All right, for our reservoir, slide that down in. And this is the reservoir tank drain hose. Slide it in here. The top hose from the reservoir runs straight back towards the firewall and then comes forward at 180. The factory reservoir mounts to this point here. We're going to mount the new PSC filler reservoir up here on this bracket on the engine. It's easiest to connect your reservoir hose first. Don't tighten it all the way, just snug it up a little bit. Next up is the anti-splash valve, and it's going to sit right over by the windshield washer reservoir. It uses an 8mm by 125 screw that'll go right into a welded nut on the factory bracket. The other end of the vent hose plugs right into the push-in fitting on the fill reservoir. And that allows the system to vent. Now, if you need to service your air filter, all you need to do is push in the hose and the collar and then pull the hose out. Just make sure to plug it back in when you're done. Next up is that burly PSC Pitman arm. We'll want to make sure that we line up the marks on the sector shaft and the big bore case, and then we're going to add a little bit of red Loctite. Face the arm forward, slide it up to the splines, and it is index, so it's only going to go forward one way. Now we can slide in our lock washer and our nut and tighten it down. Now it's time to connect the steering shaft up to the new big bore steering box. Now at this point in time, if you're installing the standard big bore kit, you can just do a fill, a bleed, and go out and run it. But because we're building the giveaway Gladiator with all those big parts for the big off-road trails, we're gonna add a PSC hydraulic assist cylinder, and it's going to mount right here between the axle and the tie rod assembly. And what that's going to do is help push and pull those big 40-inch tall tires left and right, which will be very advantageous on the harder trails. Now you may be asking, at what point in time do you need a hydraulic assist cylinder? And we're going to tell you it's right around the 37-inch tall tire range, though it really depends on the size of the tire and the trails you plan on running. Now, if you want a big bore kit, but you're thinking you maybe don't need a hydraulic assist cylinder until the future at some point in time, we recommend that you get the assist cylinder ready big bore kit. That box will have the 2 ports you need to run hoses down to an assist cylinder in the future. Now for this next part of the build, we need to move next door to the mechanic's shop to where we can do some cutting and welding. Now that that's done, we can install that PSC Hydraulic Assist Ram. And yeah, we didn't show you a whole lot of the cutting and welding process because, well, there's a lot of variables. And it depends on your vehicle, what axle you're running, and even how much lift you have. Now, if you still have the factory axle and that factory tie rod assembly, PSC does offer a bolt-on bracket kit that makes installing that PSC Ram really simple. We're going to show that to you now. Now first up is an 18mm socket to remove the nuts on these 3 bolts. Next up is a 13mm socket to remove the 3 bolts holding the axle side bracket in place. So this diamond shaped bracket that goes here on the factory tie rod. Now this bracket here is the axle side bracket, and on the back we have this block, and it's going to go right up against the axle tube, and then these 2 bolt holes will bolt right into the factory holes on the FAD. Before we do that though, we have these 2 saddles, and they're going to go around the axle tube, and then we can slide a bolt up and through, and a washer on the nut on the back side. Hey, wherever that one went. Now we can rotate it up and put the 2 face bolts in. Now the reason we do these 2 bolts last, it allows us to rotate this bracket down and allow us to slide the bolts up underneath the tie rod assembly. You do need to make sure your saddles are square to the bracket. You can see this one's squared up. This one here's got a little bit of an angle. So just tap it into place and finish tightening. So now we can take our ram, slide it in on the tie rod assembly side. Now we do need to loosen these caps just a little bit. And that's just to allow air to get inside the cylinder so we can extend it over to the other side. And then we can drop our bolt in. Then your hydraulic hoses will drop right down into these ports. And once you have your cylinder positioned properly, then we can tighten up the jam nut here. And don't forget your nuts on the bottom of these bolts. And also on the bottom of the bracket bolts on the tie rod assembly. So there you have it, the PSC Hydraulic Assist Ram on a factory axle with the factory tie rod assembly. Now this bracket does only work with the factory tie rod assembly because it has provisions for these 2 bolts. So none of the aftermarket tie rod assemblies will work with this bracket. So if you have something different in your vehicle, you can contact us and we will help get you the right brackets to fit your vehicle. Now on the giveaway Gladiator, we have that ultimate Dana 60 and that massive SteerSmarts tie rod assembly, and we're going to do something just a little bit different. Now, as you just saw, installing the PSC Ram with the factory components is really easy. Now, if you have an aftermarket axle like this Ultimate Dana 60, or maybe even a custom axle, you will need to know your steering stroke. Let me show you how we measure that. The first thing we need to do is steer all the way to one side. So then we're going to use a square, go up against the axle tube, and then slide it over against a known reference point. For this Dana axle, we can use this casting. We'll grab a piece of tape and set it right up against the square, and then make an arrow to indicate the square. Now we're going to steer all the way to the other side, and we're going to set our square at that same point. One more piece of tape right up against the square. And again with the pen to make our little arrow. So now we're going to grab a tape measure and measure from arrow tip to arrow tip, and that shows 7 inches. Now with 7 inches of steering stroke, we're going to need to adjust the steering stops at each knuckle, 1/8 of an inch per side. That's going to shorten our steering stroke to 6 3/4 inches, which is the recommended assist cylinder length for the Ultimate Dana 60 in a JLJT. Steering stops on our Ultimate Dana 60 is right here at the back of the knuckle, and it takes a 9/16 wrench. Make sure there's a little bit loose. And if we measure them, they're at 1/2 of an inch. So let's go ahead and go out to 5/8 of an inch. Now we'll take a second wrench and tighten the inner nut to lock it in place. Now we're going to do the same with the other side. We want to measure our stroke measurement one more time to make sure we are right. And there we go, 6 3/4 inches. And there we have 6 3/4 inches. So we know it matches that PSC Ram perfectly. And you may ask yourself, why do we need to match it perfectly? Well, you have a hydraulic ram in there with lots of force from that new high performance pump. And it will wear out parts, tear things up, even break parts if you don't have everything matched up. So make sure that you match your cylinder stroke and your steering stroke the same. To install that hydraulic cylinder, we want to steer all the way right lock. And then we're going to slide the hydraulic cylinder in on the axle side. And we want to have that ram bottomed all the way out. And we're using a PSC clamp on the tie rod assembly. You want to make sure that you match the tie rod clamp with your tie rod assembly. We're using that massive SteerSmarts 1 3/4 aluminum tie rod. So we're using the 1 3/4 PSC clamp. Zip tie those lines together. Now you have to go through and double check where everything's at so that as you cycle, that none of this stuff is hitting. Things are getting really tight. It was tight before without the hydraulic cylinder in place. Now with the hydraulic cylinder, we had to move our clamps for the drag link, and we've got to be careful about the hose. So we'll have to cycle it a few times, see what hits where, make those adjustments. Now we're on to the fill and bleed. Remove the cap from your fill reservoir. Now it's a good idea to tuck a bunch of rags in and around your fill reservoir just in case you have a spill. And start adding fluid. So as we're adding the fluid, it has to drain through the fill reservoir down into the reservoir on the frame, fill that up, and then we can start working it through the whole system. Once the fill reservoir is no longer draining out, we now want to have somebody in behind the wheel and get them to work the steering wheel back and forth. They're going to start out just by going 1 or 2 turns to the left, 1 or 2 turns to the right, and that's just to start pulling that fluid down through the system. After it starts pulling it through, you'll see more fluid sucked down. You'll also see air bubbles coming up. Then start the engine and cycle the steering from lock to lock 10 to 15 times. Then turn off the engine and let it stand for 10 to 15 minutes to allow any air bubbles to work out of the system. You'll repeat those steps until you see no more air bubbles in the reservoir. PSC's recommended fill level is about 1 inch below the bottom thread with the tires turned all the way to the right, so the steering cylinder is collapsed. Then turn the tires all the way to the left, extending the assist cylinder. There should still be some fluid in the bottom of the fill reservoir. Now, once you're sure you got your system fully bled, you can bolt some tires on and take it for a spin. Well, except you got to put the vehicle back together first, and well, I guess I better get at it. Easily steering those 40-inch tires through the rough stuff is what the PSC Hydro Assist kit is all about. You now have a hydraulic ram down on the axle helping push and pull that steering left and right. And when it comes to big tires, it makes a huge difference. So if you're looking for a PSC Hydro Assist kit or just a big bore kit for your JL or JT, well, look right down in that description box where you'll find links at Northridge 4x4 for a kit that'll fit your Jeep. Then hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and then hit the comment section and let us know, what do you think of the PSC kit? And until next time, thanks Northridge Nation.